tragedy today, though Iranians were victims of it, and more Lebanese, unfortunately, than Iranians were victims of this tragedy. But that should be a reminder for all of us. That should be an alarm for all of us that we need to deal with this issue. And unless we deal with this issue seriously, it will engulf all of us.
Ominous words there from the Iranian government, as at least 23 people were killed and another 140 injured in twin suicide bombings at the Iranian embassy in Lebanon today. This is one of the worst bombing attacks in southern Lebanon since the civil war in Syria began. And it comes as a third round of talks over Iran's nuclear program is set to begin in Geneva tomorrow. So is the embassy attack a sign the violence in Syria is now spilling over into Lebanon? What impact will it have on the stability across the region? Joining me now, Einat Wilf. She's a former member of the Israeli Knesset, where she was a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. She also served as foreign policy advisor to Shimon Peres. Good to have you here. In Washington, Paul Salem, the vice president for policy and research with the Middle East Institute. Good to have you here as well. Einat Wilf, let me start with you. Today's bombing in Lebanon, of course, will have significant repercussions on. What is, in your view, what impact could this have regionally as we see clearly spillover effects from Syria?
This is clearly what happened. It's a very dangerous spillover of the Syrian crisis into Lebanon. It is a thing that terrifies Lebanon. Lebanese are still traumatized by the civil war in the 70s. The last thing they need or want is a spillover of the Syrian violence and sectarian violence into very fragile Lebanon, and something of the sort raises the specter of destabilization within Lebanon, which clearly is a very dangerous prospect.
Moments before an al-Qaeda group took responsibility for the bombings, Iran allegedly put some of the blame on Israel or serving Zionist forces. There is a concern, given the history of Israel and Lebanon, that this now is the first step that moves Israel, drags Israel closer into the Syrian conflict and engulfs Lebanon again. What's your view on that?
Throughout everything that happened in Syria and now in Lebanon, Israel has been very careful and prudent to stay out of it. Israel absolutely has nothing to do with what is happening within Syria, certainly within Lebanon. We have every interest to see a stable Lebanon to the north of our border. And our leadership has been very careful and very prudent not to be dragged into the conflict. There are those who will try to drag Israel in.
But Israel's not responsible for the bombing, that's clear.
Oh, of course not. Even Hezbollah defined it as whoever did it served the Zionist forces, which is essentially tantamount to admitting that they know that Israel didn't do it, but they would still like to blame Israel anyway.
All right, Paul Salem, what's your view on what happened, and if the Iranian foreign minister is right that this is the beginning of an issue that will engulf the entire Middle East?
Well, the Middle East is, to some degree, in big parts of it, already engulfed. There's a major proxy war going on in the Levant, effectively in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. It's a very hot war in Syria, as we see today. Countries in the region lined up for or against one or the other side. Even international powers like Russia and Europe and the US lined up behind one faction or the other. This goes along sectarian lines, generally through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, that Sunni-Shia fault line. There have been obviously simmering battles in Iraq since 2005, 2006. Lebanon has suffered from this for a good while now. Obviously, Syria is now fully in flames. The events of today, the very unfortunate events, certainly is a symptom of that, is also pretty much a direct spillover of the fighting that's taking place inside Syria. It's not the first bombing of this kind. There was another similar one in the summer, in August. It didn't target the Iranian embassy, but it targeted areas in the southern suburbs of Beirut that were close to Hezbollah. So it's not the first of its kind, but it's certainly a worrisome pattern.
Does this, let me stay with you for a minute, Paul Salem, does this have knock-on effects on the nuclear negotiations as Iran resumes nuclear talks with the West in Geneva tomorrow? Do the events in Lebanon, this bombing, does that have an impact?
Not directly and not really. I mean, the bombing, you know, if Iran or Hezbollah could have blamed or had it seen the U.S. behind it, maybe that would have had some impact. But I think it's pretty clear that the group that claimed it, if indeed it is this group, the Abdullah Azzam group linked to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is an enemy of Iran, it's an enemy of the U.S., it's an enemy of Russia. So I don't think the bombing, although it targeted the Iranian embassy at this delicate time, is more part of the Sunni-Shi'i battles inside the region, not directly related to the P5+1 dynamics or the talks there. I don't think it will have a direct impact. Actually, Iran is feeling fairly, I would say, secure. It has a strong position in Iraq, a strong position in Syria, a strong position in Lebanon. One bombing will not alter the balance of power.
Einat Wilf?
I do think it will have one kind of impact. Iran has now launched a PR war. I think it even took a PR firm. And this has the consequence of kind of reminding the world the kind of things Iran is involved in, such as assisting the butchery of Assad in Syria, being involved in Lebanon, and undermining the Lebanese government and the Lebanese country. So I think this, for Iran, and one of the reasons they would like not to discuss this issue too much, reminds the P5+1 some of the other things that Iran is involved in and some of the reasons why the world should not be so quick to trust Iran.
Let me stay with you for just a minute, because I'm intrigued by the growing tensions, frankly, between Netanyahu and Kerry and, frankly, Obama on the negotiations with Iran. There's been a public disagreement now, maybe unprecedented, hard to use that word, though, but this highly vocal exchange about the position that Netanyahu has taken, which is all uranium's got to stop, versus a more negotiated settlement. Give me a sense of Israel's position as to regards to these negotiations with Iran and where they stand with the U.S.
First of all, it's a structural disagreement, and one that was always bound to happen, because Israel and the United States, by definition of their different geopolitical situation, have very differing perceptions of the threat of a nuclear Iran. The United States is separated by two oceans. Israel is a small country right in the middle of the Middle East. The United States can decide to pivot away from the Middle East. Israel doesn't have that luxury. So obviously we have a very different perspective of the threat that might come from Iran.
But how does that perspective affect the negotiations?
By definition, Israel, in order to feel secure, needs Iran to have fewer capabilities. The United States can feel secure with Iran having some more capabilities. Ultimately, it's a question of capabilities and intent. If you don't trust the intent of the Ayatollah regime, you don't want them to have capabilities at all. And this is certainly the situation.
But does the maximalist position of Netanyahu prevent him from entering any kind of negotiation to start a bending rhetoric away from kind of the annihilationist rhetoric that you'd heard before from Ahmadinejad towards something else, some kind of negotiated position between no uranium and some kind of maybe domestic production?
Netanyahu realizes that this is a very important and fragile diplomatic moment. He's actually worked very hard to get to this diplomatic moment, something acknowledged by the U.S. Defense Minister Chuck Hagel, that Netanyahu's work and actions have helped get Iran to the table. This is a very rare moment with the possibility of having a good diplomatic outcome and avoiding military confrontation. And Netanyahu is deeply concerned that this moment is about to be wasted, that the Ayatollah regime does need sanction relief desperately, that they are willing to make a serious deal in order to get the sanctions relieved, and that the P5+1 don't understand that they are in an excellent bargaining position to substantially limit the capabilities of Iran. And what he's working very hard to achieve is to make sure that the best possible deal is gotten out of this very rare and fragile diplomatic moment.
Paul Salem, what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with her sort of analysis of where the natural Israeli position of this government is. They are more concerned, they're more proximate, they want a more maximalist endpoint, and that's true. Whether at the end of the day the Israeli government would accept a middle-of-the-road deal that the U.S. and the P5+1 negotiate while sort of maintaining the right to stay outside of it, that could be a possible outcome. But I mean, something else I wanted to mention, which was a point of great disagreement previously between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu administration, has to do with something that has in fact empowered Iran a great deal, which is continued Israeli occupation, settlement building on Palestinian land, towns and villages, which has kept the issue of Palestinian rights alive in a way that's enabled Iran to exploit and be the champion of all the hardliners in the region. That's something the Arab countries who put forward a collective peace plan many years ago are trying to diffuse, along with the U.S. and other powers, to give the Palestinians a state to take away from Iran the card of standing up for those rights which most people, including many Israelis, agree with. So, you know, these issues that relate to Israeli-American relations are linked. If there were progress on the peace process, that would certainly help all of us out with the Iranian penetration of our region.
Einat Wilf, how does that play out? What is often characterized as provocations by the Netanyahu administration and settlement buildings, which sets back not only the Palestinian peace process, but the knock-on effects it has on the negotiations with Iran. What's the explanation of that?
The facts actually don't bear any of this out. Iran supports Hezbollah. Israel is not in Lebanon, and it supports Hezbollah as an undermining power of Lebanese coherence. It supports.
But the settlement issue?
Yes, it supports Hamas in Gaza. There are no settlements in Gaza, no settlements in Lebanon. Israel is not in Lebanon. The powers
But would you not agree that moving forward on the
Iran
peace process would be a good thing to do? Or
actually,
you think that's
Iran
not relevant?
supports powers that are undermining the more moderate forces within the Palestinian Authority. So the facts don't bear out the issue that where there are settlements, there are Iran. It's exactly the opposite. No settlements in the Gaza Strip, Iran is supporting Hamas. No settlements, no Israeli presence in Lebanon, Iran is supporting Hezbollah. So the facts don't bear that out. Yes, Israel and the Palestinians need to reach an agreement, need to solve their problems, but the question of Iran and its nuclear capabilities and the threat that Iran poses to the Gulf states, to the region in general, has absolutely nothing to do with it.
All right, I got to wrap it up. I'll give you one final question, and well, since you're here, in your view, from a Canadian point of view, do you think Canada should reopen its embassy in Tehran to start re-engaging in the region?
Canada should do so only once the Tehran government or the Ayatollah regime has shown that they're serious about changing course, opening their country, developing and having hopefully more Canadian values, and going back on
embassies are to talk to people you disagree with more than the people you do agree with.
No. Establishing diplomatic relations is a sign of mutual respect, also for each other's values. When a country wants to show that it is displeased with the regime, it closes an embassy, takes the ambassador back. So opening an embassy is a sign that you accept a country, its values, you want to have relations with it, and the Ayatollah regime still has to show itself worthy of Canadian respect.
Einat Wilf, Paul Salem, I appreciate both your time today. Thanks so much. Coming up on the program, why is the Auditor General pushing for independent oversight of MPs' expenses? How much power should be handed over? Aaron O'Toole, Peter Julian, Dominic LeBlanc are standing by. No, it's not Dominic LeBlanc. It's Kevin Lamoureux. I'm just looking at my monitor. All right. Kevin Lamoureux is standing by as well. Stay with us.